don't ever get Eddie Hobbs to introduce you. He builds up expectations that makes it very difficult to stand up and speak. We're in the City Hall in Cork. It was built, the foundation stone was laid in 1932 by Eamon, I believe. The previous City Hall had been burnt down in 1920. And since the City Hall must have been built, this new state being set up, the Irish Republic, it wasn't a republic then, but it was on its way, with huge aspirations, huge challenges. The challenge was to set up a state, first of all, to make it viable. The challenge was to develop a viable economy, to stop our people emigrating. The challenge was to try and end some of the divisions that had afflicted the island, separated people north and south, between different creeds. A lot of those challenges of the 20th century are not fully accomplished, but we're nearly there. Huge progress achieved. So what is the challenge for Ireland now, today? The challenge is exactly what Edward Scher set out there. How do we decarbonise our society, our economy? That is the challenge for the 21st century. That is the big task ahead of us as a people, as for every people in every country in the world. And maybe just mentally myself, in a philosophical or metaphysical sense, I see myself, we're here today putting a foundation stone down, a metaphysical foundation stone as to how we might build a new house, a new structure, a new building, which will protect our people, which will prepare our people for the energy future that is ahead of us. Someone asked there about why don't politicians stand up in terms of and accepting some of the analysis that's here presented. This is my third ASPO conference. I was in Lisbon and Pisa before. And I'd have to say I find the analysis as presented by Jean Lahair and Colin Campbell utterly credible. Difficult as it is because there's gaps in knowledge information in different fields in different countries. But I find it the best, least vested interest, most credible account of what's happening available. I find the gatherings I would say is kind of a combination of the august, the aspirational and the academic, to be a superb forum to actually try and get a sense of honestly what is going on. I would have to say, I accept and I would challenge any other politician to defy the analysis that the likes of Bob Hirsch has presented at these conferences, that you need to start radically preparing 2 decades in advance, at least, for the nature of change that we have today. I have to say that I accept the type of analysis that Chris Grabowski has presented in terms of forgetting about the reserves. Let's just look at the flows in terms of what's happening. And when I see his analysis being replicated now, in essence, by the IEA and on the front page of the Financial Times about how tight we are, I chuckle to myself and say, look, he's on the front page of the Financial Times and they don't even know it. I have to say that I came away from ASPO last year having listened to Dennis Meadows, having a clear and precise understanding how his original analysis and others as to the limits to growth that are on this planet is still true and still holds true today. And were always true over the last 3 or 4 decades, despite the fact that maybe we had turned away from that sense or that understanding because it is uncomfortable to us. I would have to say that my heart and my spirit soared when I went to the conference Rob Hopkins organised in Kinsale 2 years ago on this very issue. So, it's not that difficult to stand up, I think, as a politician and say that this actually is a true, huge challenge. This is one that we have to take on. I'm going to very briefly just do a very quick review of what some of the challenges in an Irish context. And people will know that our economy has grown very rapidly in the last 15 years. Our economy growing up 5-7% in recent years. The energy use hasn't been growing quite the same levels, but it has been growing. Roughly 3% per annum each year, our total primary energy requirement has risen. To put it into maybe easy to understand terms, I'm always trying to simplify it down. 90% of our energy comes from imported fossil fuels in Ireland. 60% comes from oil. It's very high by international standards, any international standard. To put it in simple terms, each of us, every man, woman and child in the island, is consuming about 10 pints of oil a day. 5.5 pints go on transport, about 1 roughly in each of the areas of electricity, heating, industrial processing and a number of other smaller applications. But that's the scale of our use of oil, 160,000 barrels every day on this small island with the population, as was said earlier on, of a Californian county. And it's growing rapidly. One of the most remarkable statistics, I think, from the excellent statistics that Sustainable Energy Ireland produced in this energy area, hugely useful for policymakers, is that in 2005, at a time when oil prices effectively doubled, our use of oil in transport increased by 8% in 1 year. It's a startling statistic to show a country which is heading down, instead of a direction towards reduced energy usage, towards increasing dependence on fuel. There are a range of policy responses which are already up and running in that regard. My department has just commissioned a review on security of oil supply for Ireland, looking at both the strategic issues in terms of development issues that occur in it and storage issues and so on. The Government has set, in the White Paper published last year, renewable energy targets of 33% of electricity to be generated by renewables by 2020. We're currently at close to 10% and rising. Set heating standards, renewable heating standards of about 12% of heating by 2020. We have a greener home scheme which has been hugely successful, huge public response to it, and now we're looking at putting in new standards which will put in a triple requirement of lower heat reduction in buildings, lower emissions in the buildings, and a renewable heat component being required, renewable heat factor in any new building. We have biofuels targets of 5.75% by 2010 and 10% by 2020. And we're also starting, belatedly, but at last starting, a sustainable transport energy plan within the Ministry of Transport. There's again from the European Union. We got a lot of our positive directives in energy areas from the European Union. We have an energy efficiency action plan looking to reduce our energy by 20%, or increase our energy efficiency by 20% by 2020. Having said all that, what Eddie said is true. When you look at the projections that are done in that excellent statistical unit in SEI, the projections are that our energy use to 2020 is actually going to increase still by a further third, despite all those policy items that I'd mentioned. And that's completely counter to the direction we need to go in. The European Union has again taken a positive position in the whole climate change issue, and by setting an emissions reduction target of up to 30% by 2020, should other countries come on board. That's a huge... I was at the Nairobi climate change talks last year, and I was proud that the European Union was taking such a stance and taking such a leadership position. But that sort of target means we're right to set a 3% per annum reduction. And that sort of target means we cannot increase our energy use by 30% by 2020, so we need to do further and do more. I bring the issue of climate change in because I think the two issues of peak oil and climate change go together. There is a complementary benefit in terms of if we tackle our emissions, it would also reduce our dependency on important fossil fuels, and vice versa. I think peak oil brings a huge immediate economic imperative which backs up the moral imperative that exists in the climate change issue. So I think the solutions we need to look at need to be presided in the context of we are tackling these twin combined challenges ahead of us of reducing our emissions for the sake of climate change and reducing our use of fossil fuels, particularly oil, to protect our people from the future rapid depletion or consistent depletion that is going to occur in those fuels. In terms of the response, I wouldn't disagree with anything that was said here earlier on in terms of the layers of different response we want. We need it at the community layer, the like of work that Rob Hopkins is doing. But I would say, inappropriately maybe in a city hall, part of a city council, is we need it at local authority level. That the ills I can't remember who the quote was coming from, but it struck me as being so true. The ills of democracy are solved by more democracy in my mind. And we need local government reform because a lot of the technologies that are going to deliver energy reduction, this power down, are going to be delivered at the local level. The sort of move towards a distributed energy system where you're producing locally to where you're consuming, whether that be in electricity, whether that be in heat, whether that be in transport, all will require good local government, and then we'll leave the businessmen like Eddie and others free, in my mind. My job is not as a politician or as a policymaker to decide exactly which technology is going to apply best in any one area. I take my lead from my Green colleague in the European Parliament, Claude Turmes, who made the excellent point and said we have something like 23 renewable technologies available to us in these islands. There's 1,000 ways we can save energy. I don't know which of those technologies is going to work best, but I will set the rules and set the conditions for to give those renewable technologies which achieve the key goals of reducing our dependency on fossil fuels and reducing our emissions. We should be doing everything and will be doing everything to give people who are providing those solutions the opportunity to provide the services, energy needs that we need. I would have to say as well, I stand by parliamentary democracies as the way of actually achieving the best solution in this area. I believe if you look at the history of Ireland, the best examples and often in parliamentary democracy is when a parliament does work as a sort of national parliament, where actually you have cooperation and across the board in terms of what is an issue that's not ideological. Our exposure, the risk to our people, because of our dependence on imported oil, is something that belongs to no party, belongs to no ideology. It should be a common cause, and I'm sure will be a common cause, to all parties in this state and in every other parliament that exists elsewhere. In Ireland, when we have adopted such a cooperative approach on the key strategic direction of the country, we have succeeded in turning this country around rapidly. In the mid-50s, we had the worst immigration. Anyone who lived in London at the time would have seen Irish young men and women going over because there was nothing here. We turned from being a closed economy, which had been the policy, to being an open economy on the basis of political consensus, and we succeeded. And likewise in the late 80s, when our economy was again in great difficulty, when we were in deep financial trouble, there was political consensus, Bernard's party leader and others at the time accepting that we had to have political agreement on the broad direction we were taking, and we created what's known as the Celtic Tiger on the back of the stable political environment that then existed. We need similar political consensus in this country on the issue of peak oil and the issue of climate change. In England, they need political consensus across all three parties, and I believe it is heading in that direction. In the United States of America, more than anywhere else, there needs to be political consensus, so you stop dragging back the world an issue and start leading it in the way you can. To look at the international, I would say one thing in terms of national parliaments. There are various different solutions available to us. Tax is one of them. But tax is difficult because it's difficult for politicians to put the price of electricity or the price of energy to the level that might have a real effect. One of the interesting studies done in that SEI work in terms of energy use is that it showed the hypothesis was actually €100 a barrel or $100 a barrel was the high end, 55 was the expected end. Doesn't matter, we can't forecast exactly, but the interesting thing was the difference between the two was very marginal. Only something like 7% difference in consumption, in almost a doubling of the expected oil price. So this is our use of energy is very inelastic. It's going to be very difficult to raise taxes to the level that will actually let the market then deliver the mechanisms. And I mention that point because I think it then also acknowledges the international dimension to this. From my mind, we need to be very active, as my colleague Bernard Durkin has said, within the European Union, because our energy needs, first of all, our security depends on it. We are connected to the UK by grid and will be connected then into the rest of Europe. We are utterly dependent on the gas pipelines, because most of our electricity, or a lot of our electricity now comes from gas. So we need a common European security policy so that we know that when it becomes difficult, the taps aren't turned off. But also, I suppose, in taking that example of the European Union being active on a global level, we also need global cooperation. This maybe goes back to what I was pointing about bringing the two issues together about peak oil and climate change. In climate change, people are increasingly talking now about the need for a managed withdrawal system. A recognition, I've heard Colin Campbell say it similarly and Richard Douthwaite, that markets don't particularly handle retreat, that you need a different mechanism. And in climate change, there's a lot of discussion about an allocation system on a per capita basis that will allow the world in an equitable, fair and secure manner retreat from our current damaging behaviour. And I think that makes sense. I think it equally applies for our use of oil. And maybe the climate change targets, the sort of 3% reduction targets, will exactly deliver what we want in terms of an ordered withdrawal as well in oil. And I believe from talking to Colin and others that the level of peak reduction after we go after the peak, it might be something around 2.5% or slightly less than 3%. It's hard to know. But if it's less, it will help. Because, as I said, we will then have an ordered situation where rather than a scramble for the dwindling supplies, there would be an ordered reduction in the demand, which would mean that world's resources would not just all shoot after wherever the market was selling at the particular time. So we need that agreement in Bali and in Copenhagen next year in the climate change talks, not just to help us cut our emissions, but also, I believe, to help us have an orderly retreat from our global use of oil. Lastly, I suppose I come to the individual. And recognising, I think Jim Barry said it last night very well, the real issue we have as politicians and as people interested in this area, the scouts, someone said earlier on, people who are ahead of the curve, know about this issue, is to make it more widely accepted or more widely understood. We have yet to achieve that general public consensus about the scale of the challenge that is ahead of us. We have to convince the individual that change is needed, and actually change is part of their very makeup, part of their very being, part of their culture, part of their identity. So how do we do that? One of the things I was hoping to do in government is we've established this new climate change subcommittee, climate change and energy security subcommittee in our cabinet. And the hope is that maybe, my aspiration is that we will develop it in a very public way, so that there's public, in the same way, taking the example of Sweden, where their commission on the trying to break their dependency on oil, went into public session on television to outline some of the natures of the problem. I think that's the best example I've seen of public education in this area, achieving political consensus and then real action after it. And I think we have to follow that as a model of best practice. And then perhaps in turn, if we can take on this challenge, Ireland Turn will be an example where Mrs. Murphy in downtown Boston says, well, if they can do it in Ireland, why can't they do it here? I would last say that there's one last plank. If we're setting out foundation stones, there are other important walls in this new building we need of sustainable energy. I would say first and foremost it's education. We need to educate our people for the challenges that are ahead. We need to provide them education with sort of skills that Rob Hobson's talked about, which have disappeared in Ireland in the last 40, 50 years and which we will need to get back. We will also need clarity. I would say to people in ASPO that one of the difficult things for people coming in from the outside, and I don't consider myself from the outside, I actually like some of this detailed discussion, but one of the difficult things for people outside is trying to parse out the truth as to what the real energy return is on investment on different technologies. I equally admire, when I cited other people early on, I took huge interest in Charles Hall's analysis in terms of energy return on investment. I believe we have to be scientific and accurate about that, so individuals, when they're acting, have a clear understanding as to what the real effect of their actions are. At the moment, it's still uncertain to everyone, and I very much agree with what Edward said earlier on. There's competing kind of rivalry almost between different renewable technologies as to what the real energy return is in various different investments. That has to be made clear. But lastly, I'd say, we need a story. The extent and nature of the change we have requires more than science, it requires more than politicians, it requires a broader vision. It requires almost a philosophical shift. It requires a vision that actually, as I said, gives people their sense of identity, that their sense of identity is actually carried out in actually using less, in actually consuming less fossil fuels, in actually reducing their emissions. We need almost a philosophical shift that hasn't occurred before. We need stories to be told. We need a myth to be created, a modern myth that people can identify with, which actually explains this future that we're heading into. I think about the example, roughly the same time this building would have been built, Ulysses would have been written by James Joyce. That was a myth, a very old and yet modern myth that he created around a journey, a personal journey. And it's that level of new understanding we need. It's that level of communication that goes to the heart of people, that goes to their core, that actually makes them feel good as we move away, as we take on this energy challenge. We need a myth about a journey for man or for woman which brings us back to this planet in a much more sustainable manner. Thank you.